Good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us wherever you are for this evening's special event on care and being an extra pair of hands with the brilliant Kate Mosse and Rachel Clarke. I'm Fran Barry, publisher at Wellcome Collection, and I'm going to give a really brief introduction before I hand over to Rachel and Kate. So my pronouns are she and her, and to give a brief audio description for anyone who'd find it useful, I'm a white woman wearing round glasses and a big old gold earrings, and I've got my hair up, and I'm talking to you from my living room. For those of you not familiar with Wellcome Collection, we're a free museum and library in London that explores health and being human, making connections across science, medicine, life and art. We also publish books engaging with health and human experiences in partnership with the independent publisher Profile Books. And we're very proud to have just published Kate's stunning new book, An Extra Pair of Hands, on caring, ageing and everyday acts of love. And this beautiful, compassionate book really highlights why this vital issue of care needs to be talked about and valued so much more. Before handing over to Rachel, who'll be telling us a lot more about it, I'm going to briefly run through how we'll run the event. So the event is being recorded and will be available on YouTube after the event to watch again. Your cameras and microphones will be off, and hopefully you can see us and hear us. We have live speech to text provided by VoiceBot, and this should be appearing across the bottom of your screen. And you can also access captions via a link shared in the chat box now. When you click the link, a new tab containing the live captions will open in your browser. The event is going to be an hour long. Rachel and Kate will be in conversation with each other and responding to your questions and comments, so please do get involved. Tonight's conversation promises to be an honest, illuminating and joyful one, and it's such a pleasure to hand over to our facilitator for tonight, Dr. Rachel Clarke, who will be introducing Kate. Rachel is an NHS palliative care doctor and the author of no less than 3 Sunday Times bestselling non-fiction books. Breathtaking, published in January this year, reveals what life was really like working on the NHS front lines during the first wave of the pandemic last year. Her previous book, Dear Life, was shortlisted for the Costa Biography Award and longlisted for the Baillie Gifford, and is based on her work in a hospice, exploring love, loss, grieving, dying, and what matters at the end of life. Rachel, over to you, and I really hope you all enjoy the event.
Thank you very much indeed, Fran, and welcome everybody to this evening's event. So I'm Rachel Clarke, really delighted to be here this evening. This book is absolutely gorgeous. It's one of the most beautiful things I've read this year, and I feel very lucky to be discussing it with Kate. So to introduce myself, my pronouns are she, her. I'm also a white woman. I'm in my 40s. This evening, I'm wearing a black top, a bright turquoise jumper, and I've got my long brown hair clipped back. Couple of things to say before we start. First thing is, I imagine that many of you this evening, if you have read this book, will have lots of questions and comments, and you'll probably be keen to engage with Kate. Likewise, of course, if you haven't read the book, please don't hold back. I will try and weave in as many of your questions and comments as I can during the discussion, so it's properly interactive. And there's 2 ways to do that. If you're logged into YouTube, then you can simply use the YouTube chat function. Or if you want to ask questions and comments without being logged in anywhere, you can do so via Slido. Another thing to mention, we have got Wellcome Collection moderators in the room with us this evening, and they're here primarily to support you. So if there are any issues at all, any problems, then please just use one of the 2 chat functions to let them know, and they'll help you. They'll support you with that. Another important thing to mention is that we will be actively moderating the event, in part just to make sure that this is a safe space for everybody taking part. And that means just that any offensive language or behaviour isn't used. For instance, language that's racist or ableist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, abusive, religious or culturally offensive. None of that will be tolerated. And if anybody did share language or content like that, they'd receive a warning and they may be asked to leave the event. Basically, just communicate respectfully, as I'm absolutely sure all of you will. A couple of links to mention before we begin. One is that we're using this evening to highlight the work of a really important charity, Parkinson's UK, which is very dear to Kate's heart. And if you would like to donate to Parkinson's UK, the details of how to do so are in the chat function, or you can just search it up online. And finally, if you would like to buy a copy of An Extra Pair of Hands, then Waterstones are offering a 20% discount for the whole of the week following this event. So you just need to use the promo code WELCOME and you'll get that discount, including on signed copies of Kate's book. So now on to the main event. I am so delighted to welcome Kate Mosse here this evening. Kate is a phenomenally successful novelist. Her books have been translated into 38 different languages. They've been sold in 40 different countries around the world. Over 5 million copies of her books have been sold. She has an OBE for her services to literature. She's the co-founder of the Women's Prize, and she's a tour de force in championing reading, literature, inspiring writers, all of that. But tonight we're going to be discussing something very different. So the book that she's just written, An Extra Pair of Hands, is not, to use Kate's own very self-deprecating language, a matter of making something up. This is a memoir. It's real life, and it's an extraordinarily honest and tender and moving account of her experiences of parental care, caring for both her parents and her mother-in-law, an opportunity, as she describes it, to reciprocate the extraordinary loving care that she received herself as a child from her parents. It's a beautiful and incredibly hopeful book. And we will spend the next 45 minutes discussing it with your questions involved. So Kate, welcome, first of all. It's absolutely wonderful to have you here. And may I ask to begin with, if you could just explain very briefly to our audience what this book is about in your terms.
I will. Rachel, thank you. That was, the only good thing about being on Zoom is that you don't have to be embarrassed in the room when people do lovely things like that. And, for everybody listening, I am a short white woman, nearly 60, but I look really tall on Zoom. And I'm wearing a very sparkly polo neck, which is a mistake because it's quite hot. And it's a great pleasure to be here with Wellcome, and particularly with Rachel, who is somebody I admire enormously, and we'll come on to that later. So the reason I've written this book is because Wellcome Trust asked me. I am not a professional writer. I am a writer who makes stuff up, and that's not self-deprecating. But that's what my writing life has been about. But I realized that there are, when I was writing the book, the figure that Carers UK gave was 8.8 million. Now, after the pandemic, it's 13 million of us are unpaid carers. So we are everywhere in plain sight, but we're hidden in plain sight. And I thought, well, actually, you know what? It's about raising your voice and about talking about things that matter, and social care and what's going to happen to people is part of everybody's life. A woman has a 50-50 chance of being a carer by the time she's 59. That happened earlier for me, but for many people listening, it will be that moment. And people often think that a carer is somebody who lives there all the time. But actually, a carer is defined in NHS language, as obviously you know, Rachel, as anybody who takes any responsibility for somebody else's daily well-being. And you might live with the person, you might not live with the person, but it is the issue, along with climate change, of our time. So I just thought, you know what, you can't sit on your hands here, Kate. I've been a carer on and off for 12 years. I'm a full-time carer now for the legendary Granny Rosie, who is amazing. And some people who are listening might know Granny Rosie. And so I just thought, I need to be brave enough, I suppose, to share my experience and not feel exposed by doing that. Because unless all of us who are carers start to speak out, then actually the issue of social care, which is a can that's continually kicked down the road, is never quite going to be grasped.
Absolutely. And I suppose what struck me when I read your book for the first time was the fact that clearly some of what you've just described underpinned it. I could feel some of that suppressed frustration at the fact that this is an enormously important issue and it just isn't being tackled by modern society. And yet, although that was there in the background, in the foreground are these incredibly intimate, personal relationships with people who you love so dearly. So you're almost beguiled into forgetting the fact that the Kate Mosse who has written this book is a fiercely passionate, perhaps covert polemicist. And I wonder if you could read, there's a beautiful extract at the start of the book that just encapsulates what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I absolutely, obviously now need the glasses because, you know, I am, as we've established, 59. So I need the glasses. I'm just going to read a little bit from the beginning of the book, which is Christmas 1975. And it's a description of coming back from a family visit on, you know, at Christmas time. And it wasn't to my aunt and uncle. And I think my wonderful and brilliant cousin who used to work for Wellcome Trust and her wife are listening tonight. So if you are here, Fee and Kerry, hello. But it was, so I've started off explaining that sort of sense of what it was like to visit people at Christmas and come back. And I'm just going to read the end of that bit. I didn't then realize how exceptional this quiet, ordered childhood was, how ordinary and how precious, knowing that I was loved. And because of those very many years of being loved unconditionally and supported unconditionally, that what was required some 35 years later would be both possible and a privilege. This is not a how-to book for the 8.8 million adults in the UK who find themselves carers, nor a social analysis of the structures and inequalities in the UK care system. Though there are common challenges, everyone's experience is unique. My husband, our children, my sisters, my brother-in-law would write different stories of these same times and their roles as carers. Rather, it's a tribute to three extraordinary people: my father, my mother, and my mother-in-law, and my own personal reflections about what it means to find oneself in middle age as an extra pair of hands. It's about the nature of memory, about celebrating older people and aging, about gentle heroism, about invisibility, about family and history, about complexity, about trying and failing simultaneously, about the juggling of work deadlines, about unreliability, about exhaustion and never getting a full night's sleep, about the numbing repetition of everyday tasks, about grief, about patience, compassion and empathy, guilt and loss, about the right to die with dignity, about reciprocity, about our brilliant NHS, about learning to embrace a different pace of life, about our fading selves, about regret, about absence, about partnership, about liberation, about being lucky enough to be in a position to repay a lifetime of caring. But most of all, it's a story about love.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you, Kate. I suppose there are two things that strike me above all about that passage. One is the way you open it with a description of essentially reciprocity. So you are modelling the way in which you care for your parents on the love and care that they demonstrated to you as a child. And that strikes me as a wonderfully privileged way for anybody to start out life. And the second thing that strikes me is that in that description of what this book is about, in a sense, much of what you're describing there is hidden. It is not what we talk about in society. We're all busy and overwhelmed and trying to make our way in the world with our problems and pressures and mortgages and so on. And it's easy for care to be pushed to the margins of our lives. To some extent, are you trying to push care centre stage with this book?
Yes. I mean, yes, and yes. I think the thing about care is that I didn't realise I was learning to care all of my life. And so my parents, my lovely dad died in 2011, and my mum died in 2014 very suddenly and surprisingly on the shortest day of the year, which was a year she'd always hated, the 21st of December. And she had been on stage 2 days before that in fishnet tights and, a red skirt and singing Wine and Wild, Wild Women, in part of, it was fantastic. She and Granny Rosie were in a entertainment troupe, and they went round to hospices and old people's homes and hospitals entertaining. And the people on the stage were older than the people that they were entertaining, but they were just amazing people. But what I didn't realise, I suppose, until I was writing the book, was that sort of sense of community is about looking after the people that you need to look after. It's not about making a judgment about who should be doing it or who shouldn't be doing it. And of course, Rachel, you know this hugely. It's about that sense of you step up. You don't just keep to yourself. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is the sense of interdependence. So the idea that it's not about being dependent or independent, but interdependence is good. So that, and we saw this at the beginning of the lockdown when, sort of 500,000 people volunteered to be people who would buy shopping for other people. And I learnt that at my parents' knees, as it were. There was always other people in the house. They were always on committees. They were always doing things for charity, all of that sort of stuff. And so when later it came, I started to think about these things, I thought, well, that's just normal, isn't it? That if somebody needs some help, you step up. It's not about whether it's paid or unpaid or structured or anything. It's just somebody needs some shopping. So you say, shall I carry your shopping for you? It's just about being human, isn't it? It's about being a good human.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, on the one hand, the most obvious and banal and simple, straightforward thing to do, and yet on the other, maybe something that's depressingly revolutionary in modern society. And on that topic, just to explain for people who haven't read the book, so you did something which is very radical, I think, for in the minds of perhaps some of us who will read this book. You opened up your home to your parents, to your mother-in-law. At various times they lived with you, at times caring for your children, at times you caring for them. Now, some people might sort of flinch with horror at that prospect, and for many reasons, but partly because if you think about the image of care and carers in modern British society, I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say that many people fear as though particularly caring for elderly men and women might be a horrendous matter of kind of bodily fluids, incontinence, catheters, wearing pull-up pants, a sort of awful, degrading experience for both person being cared for and carer alike. And I know from my experience of working in a hospice where the carers are just the most skillful, magnificent human beings I've ever met, pretty much. That is absolutely not what care is about. But can you talk a little bit about your experience of care, the nitty-gritty of it?
Yes. I mean, I think there are two things that I wanted to do with the book. It was a really big decision whether to write the book or not. And truthfully, if it hadn't been Wellcome Trust, I probably would have said no. But because it was the Wellcome Trust, and Fran Barry, who is the most incredible editor, and I've adored working with her. She's been a brilliant guide to how to write a personal book, which I don't normally do. I thought, well, because it's the Wellcome Trust, I am prepared to kind of leap into this area. So the thing about the book, what I wanted was to say, firstly, we always talk about, or the media maybe, not everybody, about old age as a problem. It's become one of those things that people put their head slightly on one side and go, oh yeah, no, we have an older population. But hang on a moment, shouldn't we be saying, oh my God, the NHS has worked? The majority of people, unless they have a particular condition, could have an expectation of living till they're 80 or 90. And that is the most amazing success story. Absolutely, it brings with it problems about how you live longer healthily and well. And obviously, more people have issues that need to be managed and dealt with. But at the same time, we should be celebrating the fact that we have an older, longer living population. I know you would think this, Rachel, but I feel this really strongly. I've been surrounded by older people all of my life. I also think the idea that somebody who's older has less to offer, or their imagination is less vivid or wonderful than someone who's younger, is really, I mean, because we all know that it's not how old you are, it's what you do, it's what you say, it's how you are in the world, what you give to other people. So all of that side of things, I wanted to sort of kind of bang the drum for positive aging, not in any way sugarcoating the challenges that come with that, but at the same time, positive aging. On the other hand, I felt that 13 million of us are unpaid carers. And I only use the word unpaid carers, not because we should be paid, but there's obviously an entire different group of people who are paid carers who are doing an extraordinary job as well. But it's a different discussion. And we are everywhere. And so a lot of the conversations about care, you know, we all know it. The news comes on and there are pictures of very, very, very elderly people who are quite disabled, often in care homes. But what about everybody else? You know, that is true, but also there are lots of other stories to be told. So I did want to say, as a carer, of course, there are challenges and there are very difficult things. And I am in a very privileged position. I'm a writer, so I work here, right where you can all see me. My brilliant mother-in-law, Granny Rosie, is just the other side of the door. So if something happens, I'm off. Rachel will have to hold the fort on her own. Granny Rosie's got a G&T, so she's probably going to be okay. And she's knitting. She's a brilliant knitter for the Children's Hospice. She's doing all of those things. But many people don't have that. They have to give up their jobs to care for somebody. They are often, you will find an older person caring for a partner. And they are both trying to kind of keep it all together. There are 800,000 child carers in the UK between the ages of 5 and 17. And so the reason I wrote the book as well was to say, well, I want to be positive about aging. I want to be positive about what it means to be a carer. But also, every single one of us who's a carer, need to start raising our voices. Because if we start to raise our voices together, then it will be deafening. And we need to sort out social care, because don't we all want to live in a world where people who need support get it? I'm not saying that families shouldn't care for their loved ones. Of course they should. But there are many people caring for people they don't love. There are many people who are caring for people that never cared for them. And what about all the people who had a family, but that family has died? Or what about all those people who are estranged from their family? So I kind of felt, as you say, quietly revolutionary with the book. It's a love letter to my mum and dad, who were amazing, and I miss them all the time, and Granny Rosie, who's incredible. And I'm very lucky. I've got a strong and supportive family, but a lot of people don't. So if those of us who are carers don't speak up, then there's no incentive to sort it out. And it really needs to be sorted. You know this, Rachel, because you're a quiet revolutionary as well. You know, you say your stuff, you do your extraordinary work, and your book was the first book I read when I decided I was going to write an extra pair of hands. I read Dear Life, and I thought, okay, it's possible to do this. It's possible to write a book that is honest, but is also at the same time not sentimental. It is a clarion call for what we need to do, but at the same time, it's embracing of everybody who is in the same situation. And you do that so beautifully. And reading your book, I thought, actually, I can do this. I can write this book. And then I felt like I'd had a layer of skin removed. And I was like, oh my God. But now I feel, my parents, that they were great and they should be out there in the world for all the good they did. And Granny Rosie is a complete hoot. And, we were on breakfast telly yesterday, and, my entire timeline is flooded with people going, give Granny Rosie her own show. So the job is done.
So, yes. And we were talking about precisely this just before this event started, and the fact that Granny Rosie has a certain daytime TV presenter that she holds a candle to, who ended up interacting with her on daytime television and thereafter on social media, to the, I imagine, considerable excitement of Granny Rosie. And there's something gorgeous about the fact that you can be a man or woman in your 90s, maybe even 100 and above, and have every bit as much spirit and wit and cleverness and joie de vivre as anyone, whether they're 2 years old or upwards. And I think one of the things that's so beautiful about this book is you demonstrate that in your portraits of Granny Rosie and your parents. Was that a deliberate tactic on your part? You wanted to say, look, you can be elderly and still fully human.
Yes, absolutely. Because I think the biggest thing about being a carer is it's very, very much more of a challenge if you are caring for somebody with dementia or Alzheimer's. And I am very aware of how lucky I've been with each of my, my dad had Parkinson's, but was exactly himself until the moment he died. My mum didn't need care. She needed company. Because they had been married for nearly 60 years. But she didn't need care. She just needed a watchful eye. And Granny Rosie didn't. There was a 15-month gap between my ma dying and Granny Rosie having a fall, when it was like, whoa, we're out of this. And then Granny had a fall. And she's my mother-in-law, incidentally, not my granny, but everybody in Chichester, where we live in Sussex, called her Granny Rosie. I mean, she is known throughout the whole town as Granny Rosie. She's everybody's Granny Rosie. So the thing about caring is that it's, so long as somebody doesn't have dementia or Alzheimer's, which is a completely different challenge, they are still them and you are still you. And everything about how I wanted to put my dad on the page was, he was a wonderful, gentle, quiet, principled man who lived his whole life doing good in a quiet way. He was never flashy or showy. And he lived with Parkinson's for a long time, very well and very successfully. And one of the reasons I'm so glad that we're doing this for Parkinson's tonight, and if anybody's got the spare £1 or £2 or whatever, please do support them, because it's something that the research into it will make a difference. And it's a very cruel disease, and it's an ugly disease. But actually, my father lived with it for a long time until, as so often happens with these stories of aging, he caught a virus on a plane. And then he went from being a very healthy 80-year-old with Parkinson's to being somebody who was ill and needing care. And I wanted very much to put on the page the people they were. All the very private stuff is not in the book. Every time I was writing anything, I was thinking, would my parents want this on the page? Granny Rosie is here. I was giving her the pages of the typescript saying, anything you don't want. And she was going, oh, you have to put that in. And I said, I didn't think you'd want that in. She said, I don't mind. She has a very different attitude, to all of these things. But it was that sense of saying very clearly that it isn't your age that makes a difference. It's who you are, what you do, how you are in the world with other people. And we all know this to be true. There are 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 60-year-olds who don't do anything for anybody else. There's my parents, very, I know reading your book, your parents, people listening tonight, Granny Rosie, who spends her entire day knitting for the Children's Hospice. She does more good in the world than most people that I know. And my parents were the same. So that sort of sense of positive aging, about everybody matters. And of course, that extends to people with disabilities and everything else. We all know that this is a world which tends to say this person matters more than another person. Well, we all know that's not true. So I wanted to be very positive and joyous in the book, whilst, also saying it's not always, Rachel, caring for somebody who you love who is dying is not good. It's not good. But would you rather be there than not? Yeah, of course you would. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that honesty shines through in your book. You don't sugarcoat how hard it is, but you somehow manage to celebrate it as well for what it is, that act of giving back the love that you were given all through your life. There's a very pertinent question from Alex. Perhaps this is the question of the evening, and he or she asks, why is care not valued as it should be?
Oh, well, I promised I wouldn't be super political or any of those things, and because actually that isn't helpful. We know that we have a government at the moment, and we've had other governments, but it's about making every single politician take this issue seriously. But I do think that there are two reasons it's not taken seriously. Firstly, I think it's because politicians don't think it's a game changer. So, the Dilnot report, that it was all set up to look into social care in 2010. It reported in 2011. It was first in the Queen's speech, the acceptance that social care needed to be sorted out in 2015. It was an election promise in 2017 and 2019. But yet in the Queen's speech a couple of weeks ago, it's still not prioritised. So I think there is a sense that politicians of all colours and hues, and I mean that in terms of red, blue, green and yellow, rather than anything else, that they don't think it's a game changer for the electorate. So it never quite gets to the top of the list. I think there's also, I'm afraid that the majority of people caring are women, and the enormous majority of people in paid care working are women. But yet there is a superly bad disconnect. So when you look particularly over the last year with the pandemic, we often saw rooms full of people where there wasn't a woman in the room. And there are many men who are caring and doing a brilliant job as well. But if you have a whole load of policymakers, none of whom are people who care, who've never done it, then again, it's that lack of understanding about what this means to people on a day-to-day level, not understanding that during the pandemic, there are many carers. I'm in a really privileged position. I have a husband who is in it with me. We have space. My job, I didn't have to give up my job to be a carer. I was able to look after three groups of three older people from this desk, essentially, whereas there are many people who have to give up their job, all of these things. And if you have policymakers who have absolutely no idea what it might mean during the pandemic for the day centre to shut and to not have carers who can come in, so you are suddenly looking after people. So 75, I think it's 75% carers had said that they are at the end of their tether. They're not sure they can go on. I'm not in that position because I have plenty of support, but many people don't. And because many people have to give up jobs to be carers, that brings a whole host in, and the carers allowance is the lowest of all the statutory allowances. So I think if you have people who are making policy who have no idea what that feels like, then they do not understand what it feels like to be a carer. They just don't understand it. So for me, it's another reason of writing the book, is we all need to use our voices and say, guys, we understand there's a lot of pressures on the public purse, but you know what? This is the crisis now. And there are many, many people who don't have families. And there are many people who are estranged from their families. And there are many people whose families have died or are not around. So, it's a terrible cliche to say, but I think that all of these things combine to the fact that social care is not seen as a sexy issue to deal with by politics. And it's up to all of us to make it so.
To make it sexy.
Well, not necessarily sexy, but yes, obviously with our sparkly jumpers and our, and our things, but to actually just in a very gently persistent way going, you know what, guys, this needs to be dealt with because we want to live. I hope most of us listening tonight, surely we want to live in a society that looks after the people who need us most. So it shouldn't just be about your postcode or whether you have the money to pay. It should be about, what about all of those people who've lived all of their life and worked and paid their taxes? What about them? And, the strapline for Carers Week this year is making caring visible and valued. And we're not there yet. So we just need to do it positively, but we need to do it robustly.
So let me push you on that a little bit, Kate, because I think there's an elephant in the room here based on my own experience of caring for exceptionally vulnerable individuals throughout the pandemic, many of whom were elderly. I was caring for patients who died on the wards of my hospital. They were not fit or robust enough to ever have a chance of benefiting from an intensive care bed. And I would propose that there's a disconnect between, on the one hand, the kind of extraordinary public outpouring of support and love for Captain Tom, 99 years old, raising over £30 million for the NHS in his lapse of his garden, versus at the other end of the extreme, the sort of herd immunity arguments. Well, this is a disease that only affects old people, so we need to protect the economy, we need to protect the young, and we just have to accept that if you've lived a good long innings, then maybe your death doesn't matter as much as a young person's. So there's a portion of society that is expendable and there's a portion of society that is worth saving. And actually, even though I just donated 10 quid to Captain Tom's NHS Charities fundraising, I really deep down think that. Now, is that the elephant in the room, in your opinion? Is that part of why caring, and unpaid care in particular, is so undervalued? Because actually, deep down, is British society ageist? Do we in fact not all value the older members of our society as fully human?
That is such a huge elephant and such a huge question. But I think it's not just about ageism. And, your wonderful introduction, you covered all sorts of things. I think that there is at the moment, and I remember this from the early 80s because I'm, coming up for 60 now. So I've come through certain waves of how the world is seen. And I think we are in that odd stage again of survival of the fittest is, that's the most honest way of looking at things, as opposed to what does any individual bring. And I think that there's been a quite deliberate attempt to set old and young people against each other. The idea that the politicians like, oh yeah, the young people have had to stay in because we have to protect the elderly people. Whereas almost every single older person I know is like, this is awful, depriving younger people of this. We're really, so from my experience, that it hasn't come from older people at all. It's come from politicians kind of justifying decisions, and we know that a lot of modern politics at the moment is about finding, in inverted commas, the enemy. So who is the person that's making all of this? We've got to restrict your freedoms, all of this, because it's their fault. That's always been, the way that I'm afraid politicians have manipulated situations. what I think is also really interesting is that there is, and this is why I felt so strongly in the end about writing the book, is that there is a drip feed of all old people are a burden. Granny Rosie loved Some Mothers Do Have 'Em, which some of the older members will know in the 70s, you know, Frank Crawford and Betty. And she, when she's asking for something, she'll always say to me, "Oh, I don't want to be a trouble." But I think that there is a narrative of that older people are a burden. And I think also a lot of older people of my parents' generation and Granny Rosie's generation, so people in their 80s and 90s, they are so independent and self-sufficient, and they really don't want to ask for help, and they genuinely don't want to be a burden. And I think that is all really regrettable and daft, because again, people are not a burden because they need help. If you can't walk and you need somebody to help, that's not a burden. That's just a thing. You can't walk. You know, it's simple as that. You know, I can't run very fast. I've never been able to catch a ball, but I don't consider myself a burden because I can't catch a ball. So I think the way that all of these things about aging and disability, and I think that comes into it as well. You know, there was a furore earlier this year with several people, including Ian Rankin and Joe Wiley, saying, why have our disabled siblings or children not been vaccinated? And of course, underlying that is that horrible thing that they somehow matter less, whereas all of us have it in us to step up. And we matter because we do things. We matter because we do things for other people, because we're part of a community. And that doesn't matter what colour you are, what you look like, how old you are, what your abilities are, how you define yourself. What matters is, are you there when somebody else needs you? Simple as that, really. And so I just feel, you know, I'm annoyingly chirpy, as you know, and if my cousin is on this call, she will go, yeah, she's really annoyingly chirpy. But I just think it's about seeing the positive in things rather than the negative in things. And our politics at the moment is precisely the opposite. And it's up to all of us in the ballot box and in the letters we write to our MPs and the things that we say, to go, you know what, we don't want you to be these people. We don't want to be represented by people who are seeking division. And I think with care, it's everything about care is about telling other people that care is a burden, that the people who need to be cared for are a problem. Well, what about they gave 45 years of their life looking after your children in school? You know, so for me, it's always about switching the narrative round.
Amen to that.
Amen to that.
Yes, couldn't agree more strongly. And this leads neatly on, I think, to another excellent audience question, which I think maybe you've partially answered, but somebody has asked, what advice would you give about caring from your experience for people to maximise their dignity?
Oh, that's a really brilliant question. I think the thing that I've had to learn, I'm quite a bustling around busy person, and I'm active, you know, but I think one of the big things I had to learn was about how time runs differently when you're a carer. And two things. Firstly, they are always them and you're always you. So that, you know, as the extract I read, the reciprocity, the idea that people don't suddenly not become themselves because they can't walk or they can't lift something or they need support in the bathroom or any of those things. They're not themselves because of those things. These are, you know, is it annoying and frustrating? Yes, absolutely. But it's not, it doesn't change somebody's character. But what I really had to learn was to take time at a different pace. Everything about our paid working lives, for those who are listening who are in that position like Rachel is and I am and Fran is and other people are, is about the quicker you do something, the more efficient it is. When you're a carer, that's not the issue. The issue is, how do they want it to be done? So if Granny Rosie wants to go and get something from her bedroom herself and come back herself, then me saying, let me get it, that's not the right thing to do. Because, yeah, sure, it'd be on the table quicker. But actually, it's taking away a level of dignity and a level of agency, I suppose. That's the thing. But equally, Granny Rosie had to learn, and she's been wonderful talking about this when we've done interviews, that sometimes when she can't pick something up from the floor, it's completely okay to say, Kate, can you come and pick this up off the floor? Because it's a needle and it's fallen down and it's stuck in the groove and she can't reach it without falling out of the wheelchair. So it's about both sides learning to listen to what the other one wants. And my dad and my mum, they were great examples in this. My mum never let the things my dad couldn't do become more important than the things that he could. And she was amazing at that. And I've learned from that. The other thing I think about caring that you have to learn is you'll make a mess of it. There are many days when I just think I've really, on date, Granny Rosie is in a really perky, brilliant place at the moment. The sun is shining. But the third lockdown, she found really difficult. And she often woke up feeling really terrible, didn't want to get out of bed, and would wake up and say, I've had enough of me. That's what she'd say. Or she'd say, I've sunk beneath a level of positive health. And what I had to learn was not to jolly her out of it, but to allow her to feel frustrated with the fact that she felt awful and she couldn't walk. And she, and not try to jolly her along and all of these things. And so respect somebody's right to go, do you know what? This is no fun. I quote, I talk about books a lot in the book and the solace of nature and walking in the woods and all of these things. And I have one of the people I quote is, old age is a shipwreck. So don't pretend it's not awful, because sometimes it's just okay for someone to go, do you know what? I can't bear this. This is just too much. And often I feel that I failed, when Rosie, and particularly with my dad, when he was really having a horrible day, and you just feel such a failure when you can't make it better. But you can't always make it better. But you can say tomorrow might be better. Yeah.
That really chimes with my experience working in palliative medicine. You desperately want to fix everything. You want to make everything better. But sometimes actually the most important thing you can do with someone who maybe is in their last weeks, even days of life, is just allow them to express the enormity of that for themselves and be with them and be present in the room with them, and not do what it's so tempting to do, which is to say, no, come on, things are going to get better. Sometimes they're not. And you can do the most extraordinary good by just talking about that and sharing that, can't you?
Yeah. And allowing people to feel, that, my lovely dad at one moment said to my husband, this is enough now. And it was enough. For those of you who know about Parkinson's, that endless shaking and all of these things, he'd reached the point where it was enough now. And anybody you're caring for has got to be allowed to have their negative emotions too. This is not, Butlins. It's not a holiday camp. And I think that is a real challenge for carers. I found it really challenging because I'm naturally quite, I'm glass half full person. And I found it really hard to learn, just no, it's okay. So that they are allowed to feel like it's too much pain now, go away and have a cry on your own, but let them have their emotion.
Yeah, absolutely. You're very honest about your grief in your book when first your father and then your mother die. And I wrote down a phrase. I thought this was beautiful. You describe grief as a living thing, brittle and vivid. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Well, I think I was very, I not smug quite, but ever so close to smug, which was that when my dad died, he had a very strong Christian faith. It was a very peaceful dying and a very peaceful death. From that point of view, that he and I had always been very close. We talked a lot about what he wanted, My ma didn't want to talk about end of life with him, but she must have done, because in fact he gave me a list of the prayers he wanted and the hymns he wanted, and then this beautiful thing at the bottom just saying thank you, and it was so him. But my ma must have typed it, so she must have overcome that. She didn't want to talk about those things, but I was very happy to talk to him about it, because he absolutely believed that he was going to see his mum. He was going to see the men who had died next to him in the war. He was going to see friends who'd already passed over. And I'd always hated all the euphemisms about passing over and moving on. But when you're with somebody who has that real sense of adventure, which is what my dad had, that he was about to start a new adventure, didn't want to leave my mum. But apart from that, he felt quite excited about the next thing. And I utterly underestimated how much easier that made it for all of us. So when he went, and I'm using that language now, when he died, but it did feel like he'd gone, that the Auden poem had gone into another room. He felt very much with me all of the time. And I would walk out, where we are now in Sussex, and I'd walk out in the fields, and I would often look up and have a chat with him and all of these things. When my mum died, which happened very quickly and very suddenly, so she was feeling quite ropey. She had COPD and she'd got a heart issue, but she was beautiful and energetic and wonderful. And she had seen decline and she didn't want to do it. And I'm still absolutely sure of that. And I put her cards in the post and she felt a bit ropey. And the next day I had to call an ambulance. And when the ambulance people came to see how she was doing, we were talking about her living will. And it was 36 hours. And I had to ring people up and say, Barbara's died, and people were like, well, that can't be true. I've just got a card from her this morning. So a very different experience, and it was such a shock. And I thought that I was good at grieving, but what I discovered then was that I wasn't good at grieving, because I had been prepared for it and my lovely dad was ready for it. But the worst of it was that he had always felt quite close to me all of the time that my ma was here, but the minute she died, it felt like they'd gone together. And I couldn't write at all. I couldn't even read for months. And it was an extraordinarily painful experience. And all of those people who say, oh, yeah, but they had a good innings, you think, yeah, and it's that cliche, the more you love, the harder it is when you lose them. And many people obviously have not been lucky. They've not had parents who've loved them. But it was an enormous thing for me. And I write quite a lot of, I'm a novelist, and I've written lots about death and it was interesting to discover how accurate that had been, because it felt like the end of things, that nobody had ever felt it before. And then, of course, all of those other things that you come through it. You know this, Rachel, you've written about it so beautifully yourself with your dad. All of those landmarks, as it were, you go through, the anger and the denial, and it is how it goes. And now I feel very close to my parents in the landscape. And Rosie misses my parents too, and my husband does. But I don't ever feel I wish they were here, because I know that actually my father's life, he'd reached the end of it, and my ma didn't want to be ill. So, because you do this every day. I've only had it twice, and you live with this, which is why your book is so amazing and wonderful, and was such a comfort to me when I was reading it. We'd never met before. Well, we haven't met now. We're still meeting on a computer, but
but we know each other so well.
We do now. Yes,
yeah, it's true. And that leads neatly on to a question from Suzanne, who says your books are normally fiction. So, based on your last writing experience, which is harder to write, non-fiction or fiction?
Oh. Well, do you know what? Actually, I found writing An Extra Pair of Hands very liberating, oddly. I don't know if you found that with your writing. Once I decided to do it, it felt like sinking into the swimming pool. and just swimming up and down in lengths. Whereas quite often with a novel, it's like standing on the cliff and deciding, are you going to jump into the sea? And the sea is really choppy and, you might go under and it's not, where is the end? There's no end in sight. So I really enjoyed writing the book. I did write it during the pandemic. It had been commissioned before that. So it wasn't something that came out of last year, but it was a very good book to write, and it has absolutely made me feel that I would like to write more personal nonfiction. Much of it's the same. I was very, very lucky to have Francesca Barry at the Wellcome Trust as my editor, and she was very, very wonderful, stopping me from becoming too novelistic sometimes, and all of those things. But I think, in a way, I think fiction's harder. Once you've decided to commit to writing a piece of nonfiction, it tells you what you need to do. Whereas with a novel, that thing about making it up, it's where is the end? There's no wall, there's no finishing point, whereas with nonfiction, there is the sense that, the story chooses its own shape.
Yeah. We are sadly run rapidly out of time, but I have time just to ask you one more question, if I may, to finish. And it's simply this. You write in An Extra Pair of Hands about the fact that you believe, and I think you're 100% right in believing this, that the measure of a society, of how civilized a society is not how we treat our elites, it's how we treat our most vulnerable members. With that in mind, how would you like to end? What is your clarion call for how we do things differently?
I think see everybody as they are. One of the stories I tell about my dad in the book is that he made it possible for people around him to not feel embarrassed about his Parkinson's. People don't know how to deal with disability, and they don't know how to deal with older people a lot of the time. And so therefore that becomes isolating because people turn away rather than engage. But once we were in a pub, and it's a pub we'd been into loads of times, and my dad was in a wheelchair, and we went to the bar, and he said, I'd like a glass of red wine, but I'd like it in 2 tumblers, please, because then if my hand shakes, I won't spill it. And it liberated everybody in the bar. They didn't know quite what was wrong with him, but now they did, and nobody had to pretend it wasn't happening. So I think it's just all of us, whoever we are, just talk to the person in front of you. Don't be embarrassed. It doesn't matter if somebody has a different ability to you. Just look them in the eyes and have a conversation. Granny Rosie taught for many years at a local school here for physically and mentally disabled young people. And we still meet people in town when we're out with the wheelchair who will go, oh, you looked after my son, 90s, 90 or whatever. And that was what Rosie always did, just the person in front of you. And you do that, Rachel, and I'm sure everybody listening. If we can all do that, then we look beyond any definition to who are you? It was when my ma was dying, there was a wonderful Iranian doctor, and she said, your mother is rich in years. So she wasn't looking at a suddenly ill older woman. She was just looking at, and she said, tell me about her. Wonderful doctors that make all the difference at that moment. So I think it's that. And I would also say, just do what the Deal Not Commission suggests. If we do that, we're fine. Let's just do it and build a better society for everybody, whatever their abilities. And it's really not even complicated, is it? It's not complicated.
It's perhaps the most simple and most revolutionary idea anyone can express in 21st century Britain. Kate Mosse, thank you so very much for this evening. I do not imagine a single person listening has not been inspired by what you've shared this evening. Thank you very much indeed. And to close, I will just wrap up to say once more that if you would like to make a donation to Parkinson's UK, the link is in the chat, or you can just go online and find the charity there. Wonderful charity doing wonderful work. And if you would like to buy an extra pair of hands, then Waterstones are offering their 20% discount. You need to use the promo code WELCOME to order that. And there will be lots more Wellcome Collection events coming up. So please keep an eye on the website for those. To everybody this evening, particularly Kate herself, thank you so much for taking part. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege. Good night.
And to you, Rachel, I hope we meet soon in the real world. Thank you so much for a lovely talk and for Wellcome for organising this.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.